von der Leyen has said all of the cards are still on the table. She's really speaking Trump's language there. Politically, it's pretty unattractive. If those medication prices go up, that's really not something that's going to bode well for midterms.
The United States has given itself 90 days to reshape dozens of economic relationships, including with the world's largest single market, the European Union. The two sides have been talking this week, but so far, no deal's been done. Right now, the dispute is centred on goods, but an escalation could see services affected too. To find out what all this means for consumers, I'm joined now by Sophia Busch, Assistant Director at the Atlantic Council's GeoEconomics Centre. Sophia, thank you so much for joining us today. Now, the EU came to the US with a proposal of zero tariffs on both sides. How was that offer received in Washington?
So I think in Washington, it's always helpful to show this signal of openness, which I think the EU has done in a very clever way. However, it's not enough, unfortunately, for the White House to really work with, because it doesn't address some of the key pain points that are inspiring these tariffs. So when we're talking about the zero for zero deal, that really was only covering industrial imports, which is important because cars are a major pain point, but it doesn't address digital services taxes or pharmaceuticals or all of these other concerns that the administration has, including better market access for U.S. agricultural and energy imports. So I think it's, a smart step, but unfortunately not enough to sway the White House at this time.
Do you get the sense that the EU is willing to budge on any of these issues?
I think just because von der Leyen has been so open about a willingness to negotiate, I think there is legitimate efforts there, especially given that the EU has continually been consistent about this message about its openness to trade, its reliability for supply chains and businesses. And all of that can't really happen if relationships are stressed with its largest trading partner and, most important ally. So I think there's certainly that positioning there for progress, but a lot of these issues are so core to the EU that we'll see, I guess, how far this relationship can be stressed before there's really serious movement.
You mentioned the distinction between goods and services, and I want to look a little bit more closely at this relationship. First, let's look at goods. Here in the EU, the top import from the US is oil. Now, Trump's indicated he's willing to budge on tariffs if the EU dramatically increases its purchase of American energy. Do you think this is likely to happen? And if it does, what would that mean for energy bills here in Europe?
I think this could be one of those aspects that could be more of a win-win for both, depending on how it played out. So already the US makes up 45% of where the EU gets its LNG, liquefied natural gas. So there's already that important relationship there, and it could be beneficial for EU energy taxes, especially as we're heading into the winter and fall. However, it really contradicts the EU's efforts to move towards a green transition. And I think that's where the key conflict is going to be. And that's what makes me the most concerned about whether that concession could actually happen with the EU buying more US LNG. However, it is one of the first things that von der Leyen suggested would be on the table even before we saw the actual threat of reciprocal tariffs playing out. It was one of the first things that she suggested they could budge on.
Okay, so some possible movement there. If we look at the relationship going the other way, the EU's top export to the US is pharmaceuticals. Now, Trump says he will hit this sector with tariffs. How would that cost be absorbed in the US? Would insurance companies pass those higher prices on to consumers?
I think it's certainly possible that, medications could get more expensive in the US. However, this is really not something politically attractive or helpful to the Trump administration, especially if you look at the different kinds of medications that the US is importing from the EU. So that includes medication for type 2 diabetes, arthritis, vaccines, and many, many more of these really critical medications that are used by really everyday folks, and also the, baby boomer and older generations here in the US that are more likely to be, within Trump's voting cohort. So politically, I think it's pretty unattractive. If those medication prices go up, that's really not something that's going to bode well for midterms.
For sure. And it's a big concern here as well, here in Europe, because there are a lot of big name international pharma companies operating in the EU, particularly in Ireland. And they have actually written to the European Commission demanding help to maintain operations in the EU to counter these US tariffs. What kind of support are they looking for?
Yeah, I mean, I think these companies really need to make sure that they have secured markets, consumer markets, and the US is the most significant consumer market in the world. So certainly strong efforts to negotiate with the US at this time are going to be incredibly important. And I would also note that this is really incredibly important for the US as well, given that outside of the EU, who do we have for our alternatives? There's China, there's India, but really, who do you want to be buying your medications from? I think obviously your ally. So, of course, I think these negotiations, I would hope, would be some of the most constructive and engaged on both sides.
Right. OK, so that's a really high stakes sector there. Now, so far, we've talked about trade. Let's look at services, because when it comes to services like finance or tech, the US actually exports more than it imports. So it's the opposite to what is happening with goods. The EU actually has a new tool, the so-called trade bazooka, that it could use to target these services. What would it take for European leaders to agree to deploy it?
Right. I think so. Even within the EU, there's plenty of disagreement on whether this would be favorable, and it depends country by country. But I think there's a couple risks that are really the most important to dissuade something like this from happening. So, first of all, it's something that takes a little longer to even happen. So it could take 3 to 6 months just for the consultation process to happen. And if you're following trade policy in the US right now, you know that things are changing so much quicker than that. So I think it would have to get to a point, first of all, where US protectionism against the EU looks like something that's going to stick for a long time. And we don't even know what's going to happen at the end of these first 90 days. So I think within the EU, you really want to see that this is going to stay in the US for some time before you're going to add this instrument, which takes longer to really complete and is harder to remove than everything that the Trump administration is doing right now. So I think that's maybe the first thing that I would look for.
OK, if we look at the breakdown of US services exports to the EU, the biggest category is professional services. Now, this includes things like consulting, legal advice, even advertising. How would targeting this sector actually look in practice?
So I think there's plenty of major US companies that operate in the EU, that the EU within the anti-coercion instrument can very easily target directly. So that looks like revoking their licenses or even putting a ban on imports of those services. So I, of course, think that that second option would be very unlikely. But what you see here is that there's a range of options that could happen with the ACI. Unfortunately, there's really no strong alternatives at this point for these digital services. So the EU relies so heavily on the US that any kind of action here would harm US companies, that it would be targeting almost as much as consumers in the EU, I think.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that, because if you consider how much we all rely on the likes of Google, Microsoft and Amazon for everything, from cloud storage to email, I do wonder, could the EU really afford to target them, or would it be an own goal?
I don't think it would be favorable for EU consumers to target them. There's no alternative in the EU right now. So if these services go away or even just become more expensive, I don't see how that's going to be beneficial for consumers in the EU. And I think that's, one of the second risks in doing this trade bazooka is, where do you go from there,
Yeah, exactly, because I think services can be so intangible compared to goods, but, it would include everything from like streaming platforms, right? I mean, should EU consumers be worried about their Netflix subscriptions getting more expensive, for example?
Yeah, I think Netflix and streaming is a major thing, as well as cloud services. So, yeah, I think if this trade bazooka was used, it does seem more intangible, but then when your Netflix subscription gets more expensive, that's pretty tangible once that actually happens.
Absolutely. And Sophia, finally, I'd love your take on what you think the chances are of the EU and the US actually making a deal before this 90-day tariff reprieve is up.
So I think the Trump administration has been highly unpredictable in how it's been using its trade policies so far. But I think even just the fact that there is a 90-day pause indicates that when US markets are under stress, especially the bond market, the administration is genuinely willing to step in and take down some of that pressure. And I think also the EU has gotten better treatment than trading partners like China. It seems like the US is really focusing its attentions on negotiations and pressure on China, and taking a little bit of pressure off of the rest of the world, at least for 90 days with the EU. I think that's a helpful sign. I think also the EU approach is going to be helpful as well in getting something constructive, where they're first signaling that they're open to negotiation, they're willing to get some kind of deal. That's, I think, symbolized very well with the 0 for 0 tariff option, even though it wasn't enough for the US. But then secondly, von der Leyen has said all of the cards are still on the table. She's really speaking Trump's language there, which shows that the EU does have leverage. They're willing to use it. They're not taking it off the table. And I think when you're seeing both of these sides acting in this way, it's indicating openness and an acknowledgement that this relationship is so important. It's going to be hopefully treated better in the upcoming 90 days. And we'll really be looking to Vice President Vance's trip to Italy in the coming weeks, to see if there's any constructive movement there in his conversations with Maloney.
We'll be keeping a close eye on that as well. Sophia Busch from the Atlantic Council, thank you so much.
Thank you.